Hello and welcome back. We are here today to talk about the one and only, the man of the year, in my year reading him. This is Mr. Thomas Pynchon. So, as many of you probably know, Thomas Pynchon has had quite a year this year in pop culture, maybe the biggest pop culture year for Thomas Pynchon ever. I was not expecting that going into this year, and so I'm going to talk about my reading of the last 12 months, which has been a huge amount of Thomas Pynchon books. Not all of them, and ultimately probably close to about half of them, if anything. Um, and really just the fact that my plans for this year were not to read 5 Pynchon books in the last 12 months, but to read maybe one, maybe two, and it ballooned into this, and I'm going to talk about my whole experience. I'm going to talk about it chronologically. So if you're here to hear my thoughts on the new one, the new Shadow Ticket over here, it'll be towards the end. You can skip ahead if you want. I don't really care. But I would also think that if you are interested in that, you're probably going to be interested in my thoughts on the other books. So, without further ado, I will start with just kind of how my experiences have gone, which actually takes me back about 2 years ago. 2 years ago, I finished reading Gravity's Rainbow. That was my first time reading that. Not the first time attempting it, for sure, but first time finishing it. And from that point, I had also earlier that year read V. And I thought that that was a lot of Pynchon to read in 1 year. And so I said, 2024, I'm not going to read any more Pynchon, at least in the year, and then I'll save that for 2025. I made it almost all the way through 2024. What I did was back in December, I decided to read Slow Learner, which, if you are familiar, is a collection of short stories that Pynchon wrote and published in the late 50s, early 1960s. When he was very young, starting out, hadn't published a full novel yet. And this came out in 1984, in between Gravity's Rainbow and Vineland, as kind of a holdover to keep people at bay. And there's a great introduction in here that gives you some thoughts from Pynchon. He ultimately says that these stories, they're very juvenile, not necessarily in terms of content, but the where he was at as a writer. He doesn't really think that they're very good, but it's a cool place to see where he starts. People always love to point to the story Entropy that's in here as like a great example of early Pynchon, like where he gets his concepts from. And it's a good story. It's probably the most complex of any of these that are in here, and I'm trying to remember it because this was December. And really, I think ultimately what stood out to me in this collection, there's Secret Integration, which is the only time I've really heard Thomas Pynchon talk about race relations in a very direct way. And this story was published around the time of, I think it's actually prior to the Civil Rights Act being inducted. But it's a really interesting story in that aspect. I also think that there's a couple other stories in here that, if you have just read V, this is, I think, the best point in your Pynchon reading is you read V and then you read Slow Learner, because they're pretty similar in the time period. I think ultimately the writing in V takes off, and that's really where he starts to set up his concepts and style as a writer. But some of the characters are in here. Pig Bodine is like kind of played out in a different role, who's a character in V. There's a story in here which I'm forgetting which one it is. I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to guess because I don't know. But essentially it's like a first draft of one of the chapters in V. So I think it's really, I wouldn't read this before, but I would read this after, and I think it's a really insightful take into Pynchon as a writer and V as a book. I don't know if it's very good on its own. It's probably the weakest of any Pynchon thing I've read, just because it's short stories, and I think that's a pretty common take, is that the Slow Learner is it's not his best work, and even he doesn't agree with that. So ultimately going to leave it at that. But I finished this right before the new year, and so I'm going to count it in my year of reading Pynchon. Next up, I had a trip to Los Angeles planned, and so I thought I'm going to reread some Pynchon that I had read in the past. And I probably should have gone with Inherent Vice, but what I did is I ended up reading The Crying of Lot 49, which this is my second full reread of this book. I read it 4 years ago for the first time, and I've attempted it at least once, if not twice, in that time period in the 4 year period between the two. This was the second book I ever read from Thomas Pynchon, and I love this cover. I found this out in a barn. I gotta make sure I'm not covering it. I gotta cover it somewhere. There's so much detail in this cover. I love to jokingly refer to this as the movie tie-in edition. This is from the early 80s, and it is a Ballantine, is that right? Bantam. A Bantam edition, which Bantam, it's interesting because you finish this book and there's all sorts of crazy mystery and whatnot that happens in it. It has a special offer where you can mail in to the catalog department of Bantam Books, which is, or at least was at the time, up until the late 90s, off Gulf Road out in Des Plaines, Illinois. And it's interesting because that is now an empty lot, so the mystery continues. You finish reading the book and you can take it out into the real world. But yeah, I love this cover, and rereading it, I think it's chapter 3, the opening of it, where they talk about the Echo Court Motel. All of this details in it, where it talks about the no vacancy sign and like the woman and the diving pool and all that kind of stuff. And I was like really impressed because I thought this was just a cool, like, nice vibe to have on the cover. There's a couple of covers I think are really good. This is definitely up there. It's a very underrated one because I don't really see it around a lot. I think it's with being the 80s ones. The 60s ones obviously stand out a lot, and then there's a lot of them that came in the 90s and 2000s that are a little boring, but they're the more typical what you see when it comes to this book. Enough about the aesthetics though. So rereading this, this is the first time I finished through the whole reread. I think every time I reread this, I hit the play aspect. I forget what the play is called now. You can tell how much I care about the details. There's a play within the book, and every time I hit it, that's kind of where I get lost in the plot. And this time I'm not going to say I really got it, but I got through it, and I continued on past that. And that was the first time rereading that latter half of the book since reading it prior for the first time. And like I said, so I've reread it a couple times. I remember the first time I ever read this book, I read that first chapter, and then I was a little confused and like, yeah, it's a little heady to kind of piece all the things together. And then the second time you read it, and you're like, okay, it makes a little more sense. And every time I think it makes more and more sense. That's kind of how I feel about this book. It's improved with every reread, and I think that it was a really good example of the value of rereading Pynchon, is that you pick up on more. The narrative's a little easier to follow along with. There's just, it only improves. So this was a great reread, and it was the beginning of my 2025 reading Pynchon, and ultimately no complaints. Enjoyed it more than the first time. I think when I first rated this on Goodreads, it was a 4 out of 5, and this time it's a 5 out of 5. It's up there with Gravity's Rainbow for me. If anything, I'm going to have to reread Gravity's Rainbow and then compare after rereads what's really standing out. But like, just the compact nature of this story, the narrative of it, I almost prefer it. But they're almost incomparable in terms of the books. So that's all I got about Lot 49. One of my favorites, though. I think, like I said, it's up there as one of my favorites, as the favorite. After that, I do not have a copy on me, so it's a little no visual aid right now, but I reread Inherent Vice. This is right after going to LA, and I saw that here in the city of Chicago, they were showing a 35mm screening of Inherent Vice, the adaptation by Paul Thomas Anderson, back in April. And so I wanted to reread the book. I had read it once again, that was the first one I ever read, and I've seen the movie twice prior to this. Once before the book and once after, but it had been so long in between where the book lands in that timeline of the before and after that really all of those are independent experiences where I vaguely remember the prior iteration, what's going on in the story, all that kind of stuff. So I wanted to reread it. And originally, I borrowed it from my one of my good friends who, at the time we were roommates, so it was a little easier to borrow. Now a little harder, but still gracious enough to lend me the copy. And ultimately, reread it and read it in about a month, which I don't remember how long it took me the first time. Maybe about the same. And it's just really interesting because I remember while rereading Lot 49, it really reminds me of The Big Lebowski. I think I rewatched that back in December, and the Coen brothers is just, you can tell how much they take from Pynchon, especially Lot 49, to write that whole narrative out, and the kind of timing of everything, the dialogue. Like, I think honestly that might be the best adaptation of Pynchon, and it's not even an adaptation. And so it's really interesting when you go to Inherent Vice, where now the narrative is so influenced by the Big Lebowski, and so it's almost like you can see that the Coen brothers were clearly influenced by Pynchon, and then Pynchon's clearly influenced by the Coen brothers. So it's this weird hopscotching circle of inspiration, and I think there's some inherent intention behind all that. I think with Inherent Vice, it's very pop culture focused if you read the book, and there's all these needle drop moments, there's all these Laker games going on, references to very specific things like Gilligan's Island episodes or Louis L'Amour books, whatever it might be, stuff that like really puts you in that moment solely due to pop culture references, which there's a really interesting aspect to that. And if you were to think about it, this is the California trilogy. When you think about Lot 49, Vineland, and Inherent Vice, if Lot 49 is written in the 1960s during the counterculture, this is something that's supposed to capture the countercultural time period and the essence of it, and I think it really does because it's so weird and out there and almost avant-garde in many ways in how it's written. If that's Lot 49, if you've got Vineland in there that is more of a commentary on the death of the 60s and the selling out of the hippies and the rise of authoritarianism, all that kind of stuff, that's kind of that commentary on the 60s. They like to call this the California trilogy, but it really is the 60s trilogy. And then you go to Inherent Vice. This is something that was written in 2009, and from that aspect you compare we are now decades removed from the 60s. What is the memory of the 60s? And it's really all these pop culture references. I put it in my review that it was, you think back in the 1960s and you think about the songs, you think about the Beatles and the Herman's Hermits and the Turtles, whatever else, these very iconic song moments. You think about the fashion, you think about the hair, the makeup, the clothes, and then you think about like these there's other little elements too. You've got like the hippie Halloween costume. That is something that you'll probably go to a Spirit Halloween and still see is this like caricature of a hippie, whereas that used to mean something back then. It was almost a rebellious. It was a counterculture, really. I think the book it captures that really well. The Inherent Vice. It's really it's so pop culture heavy, and that might for some people they don't like that, but I think it really works because it shows that that's really when we think back on time periods. You think about the 80s now, how much of it's pop culture referenced. It's it's the fashion, it's the music, it's the the little touchstones, because that's really what is like isolated and immortalized when it comes to what was that feeling. But is that really the real feeling, or is that just the flashy new thing, the pop culture consumable content that existed at that time period? And it's so different because it constant movement of consumerism has to keep going, so there always has to be something new, something different, something more innovative. And so that like little slice of this is 1966 or 1970 or 1984, whatever it might be, is so unique because it is constantly moving past that. And of course now we're looking back at a lot of things. There's a lot of retrospectives. People are nostalgia has been tapped dry for the last decade in terms of just revitalizing everything. Inherent Vice, when rereading it, it's never been my favorite. It was the first one I ever read, and I felt that I took that with a grain of salt. Like, this is everything that I think is unique and interesting about this book probably is just unique to the author and maybe not to the exact book. Having reread it now after reading about half of Pynchon's bibliography, there are definitely elements that are unique and interesting. Like I said, the whole concept of remembering the 60s, I think, is something that I've never seen anywhere else, and I think that's miraculous. That is almost a work of genius in the way that you would want from any good Pynchon book. And really, when you go from that, some other elements that come from that, I think this is the first of any genre fiction that Pynchon does. He does a couple other ones, and we'll talk about that more with Shadow Ticket. But with genre fiction, it's similar to Brautigan, where he went into genre fiction and people didn't take him as seriously. They thought, this is a joke, this is whatever else. And now in retrospect, I think people are coming around to some of the 70s genre fiction works of Brautigan. We'll see how that goes, but I think there's still a very contentious. There's a lot of people who hate Inherent Vice, there's a lot of people who love it, and on this reread, I felt like I got a little bit less out of it. I did come around with that whole encapsulation of the three California 60s books, but there wasn't much more. I felt like I was kind of tapping out on it, and I was already kind of exhausted by the pop culture excessiveness of Inherent Vice on the first reread. I think it feels a little bit better intentionally now, but it's still not to say it's enjoyable to read. the pop culture excessiveness and that kind of nature of it. It's more simplistic to read because of the genre fiction aspect. The chapter's a little bit shorter, and we'll get into it with Shadow Ticket, but comparatively shorter than some of his other works, and really just like a lot more dialogue heavy. There's a lot of dialogues in all of his books, but I think that when you have more dialogue in this detective aspect, I think Doc Sportello is definitely the best character that Pynchon's ever written, and I love the aspect of just the elevator pitch for this book. Really is like, how a typical detective is like this, like you think of Columbo or Sherlock Holmes or whatever else. These amazing minds who can kind of think in ways that no one else can, and they solve the mysteries that way. They're miraculous. They have their wits about them. They're catching up on all these different little clues. They're picking up on the clues. And to have Doc Sportello be this like hippie who's just like a stoner and he's kind of bumbling through it and he's drugged or he's just kind of stumbling across clues. It's very humorous, and it's a really surprising subversion that I don't think you really see. I'm surprised we haven't seen when it comes to other detective novels. So I'm not going to say too much more on Inherent Vice, but I enjoyed it, but maybe not as much as the first read. Still a great time reading Pynchon. So now, and I will say that rewatch of Inherent Vice was probably the most enjoyable I've had of it. It was probably my third time watching it. Silent theater. People just really just so into the dialogue, and it was great just to really be able to appreciate it and enjoy it. So now we have Vineland, and I bought this in June. I hadn't had a copy yet. This is one that I wasn't looking forward to in the same way as some of these other books. I've got my list of where I want to go with the remainder of the Pynchon books. And Vineland was not on my top of my list. I'd heard people don't like this. It was a hard sell as the comeback from Gravity's Rainbow after 17 years. And really the only reason I read it this year is because of the PTA adaptation, which I am so sick of people referring to as a Thomas Pynchon adaptation, that this is a Vineland adaptation. It's fucking not. Let's just get with that. There's some similarities, there's some lended aspects from the book, but it is not the same. And to keep selling it as such is ridiculous. So we'll talk about the book first, and I'll talk about the movie. But I read this back in August. A lot of life changes happened at that point, and so the beginning and end are a little bit stronger in my mind, and the middle is a bit fuzzy because big stuff happened then. You don't need to know my personal life. And what kind of comes of that, there were a lot of things I like about this book. People call this Pynchon Light. I don't think this is Pynchon Light at all. I think there's some concepts in here that are just as big as Gravity's Rainbow, and I think it's ridiculous not to ignore that. There's certain things I really love about this book. There's an early chapter that takes place in Hawaii that is like as a kind of bottle. If you were to only look at that, it's a great example. Some of the best writing that Pynchon's ever done. Just like the start to finish of that chapter, just what that symbolizes, how that plays into the narrative. It's great. I really loved that. I really love some of the other commentaries on media. I think that his talk about consumerism and the pacifying the masses through television, through rock and roll, kind of like taking a subversive new element and then how society kind of like dulls it down, and then it's the pacifying of the masses aspect. There's a really interesting book right here by Neil Postman, Amusing Yourself to Death. If you like Vineland, you should probably read this. I love this cover of it. It's from the 80s. I think this was 1985 when this was published, so like very similar time period that they're commenting on. And it really, that whole thing is about how everything has become entertainment. Education has become entertainment. Religion has become entertainment. The news has become entertainment. Politics has become entertainment. And this is back in 1985. What comes of that, though, is that he goes a little crazy with it, kind of saying that, like, you can't have any infotainment. You can't have any sort of, if you're going to be learning something, it has to be, like, solely reading a book in silence by yourself or in a lecture. You can't be, like, I don't know, he bemoans, like, things like Sesame Street and whatever else. It gets a little over the top, but I think ultimately, like, I still really think he's, like, on the mark about that, and I think that's a lot more of a commentary that I agree, or I picked up from more than kind of what's in here. I think it's a little heavy-handed and violent. It's impressive that he was making these comments back in 1990, very early on compared to a lot of this. Like, they had just left the 80s, and we're still ultimately in that kind of Reagan world, if you count the Bush senior years as just an extension of Reagan, and I think those aspects are really good. I think that stuff about the film collective with the camera versus the gun, what is more revolutionary, is very interesting. I think that a lot of his going back to the media stuff, his weird surrealist shows and TV programs that he makes up are crazy. I really love how in the end there's one that's like a biopic on the 1983 and 1984 season of the Lakers, because that's essentially what Winning Time is. And it's funny because he casts Sean Penn as Larry Bird, which if we made an actual adaptation of Vineland would have been amusing. Of course, you'd have to de-age him and it would look weird. I love bringing back Mucho Mas from Lot 49. You kind of see him at the end. He goes from like this straight-laced guy at the beginning of Lot 49 to all into acid and all that kind of stuff, and then you get the carry out of that into the early 70s here, and it's great. I love that. I love the weird little aspects of that, but the middle of the book, it kind of lost me, and like I said, some of that is a little bit of external distraction. Some of it was just, it was a lot to take on, and it will probably benefit from a reread. I think of all the books to reread now, this is definitely the one, even though I didn't really enjoy it very much. Aside from the little components here and there, I think that there was just ultimately so much happening at once that it's almost like, I don't know if it could be held together. That was kind of my overall take out of it. I felt like the whole commentary of the hippies, the baby boomers sold out. The hippies became the yuppies is something that I've heard my entire life, so it's a little... he may have been saying it in 1990, but me reading it in 2025, I don't know if it really hits as miraculously as my thoughts about Inherent Vice. So I think the Inherent Vice stuff, like, it just is more relatable to the time period that I've lived in and my understanding of the 60s and stuff like that, as opposed to someone who like lived through it and lived through the 80s and all that kind of stuff. Ultimately, though, all the aspects that I liked about Vineland, none of those are included in the PTA movie. Which is what frustrates me the most. Now, I wasn't expecting much. It's not the same title. I think people should stop saying that it's an adaptation, because it's not. There's some little elements. I think some of the dialogue stuff, some of the quirkiness is him trying to emulate Pynchon. I think that there's just some really... there were parts I like about the movie, but I just, I think I like them separately, and the parts that I like from both of these are not the same. I think the movie gets a little bit too much into radicalism as an aesthetic, and that is ultimately annoying, especially considering this book is so much about media pacifying the masses and entertainment pacifying the masses, that it's like, okay, so you really didn't get anything out of this book if everyone's just gonna come out of it saying, hey, look, it looks fucking great, and the action's so good, and the acting, and I think Sean Penn does an amazing job in that movie. Benicio del Toro does a great job in the movie. Leonardo DiCaprio's whatever, I think he's distracting in it. I don't like it's amusing to know Leonardo DiCaprio, the man, and how he's got like condos in Israel, and then is going to be playing a radical guy in this movie. And that's how acting works. People are not who they play on screen, and that's why Sean Penn, I think, is so great in that. But it's distracting because his face is everywhere, and it's just I think it would have been better with a not as big a name actor as Leonardo DiCaprio. It makes sense why he's in it. It's the whole reason why everyone's talking about it, and why this movie has more acclaim or more attention than anything else PTA has done. So, enough about the movie, though. Like I said, there are parts I like about it, and I'll rewatch it, and I don't think it's like a bad movie, but I don't even think it's a top 3 PTA movie for me. I'm sure I'm forgetting something, and someone can ask me a question or get upset. And finally, we are going to talk about Shadow Ticket. This is the new Thomas Pynchon book that was announced this year. Now, going into this year, did not plan to read all these books, did not plan on reading this. I was honestly, it's funny, you see Bleeding Edge up here. That was the one I was going to read this year, and I didn't even read it. Shadow Ticket. This is the second shortest. It is a detective novel, and it is maybe my least favorite of all of his. Now, we'll get into some caveats around that. I don't think any of Thomas Pynchon's books are bad. But this book, especially after reading all 4, you don't count the Slow Learner, I would put this at the bottom. I feel bad saying that, because it's not like it's that terrible. I think the beginning is really what bothers me the most. What I am bothered by with this book is how short the chapters are, and how simplistic the writing is because of that. That's not to say this is an easy book to read or that this book doesn't have great passages. It absolutely does. The opening paragraph of this book is great. I think a lot of the openings and closing of chapters are good. And there's a lot of good concepts in here, and we'll get into talking about that. But I don't think when you compare it to all the other books that I've read this year from Thomas Pynchon or other authors, that's very, it stands out to me. I mean, if people were calling Vineland Pynchon light, this is the Pynchon 0 calories. And I don't want to keep bemoaning it as if this is like the worst thing ever. But I'm not hearing enough dissenting opinion, I guess. What comes of it? This is a book, I don't know how much I need to cover because I feel like everyone's been talking about it. It is a detective noir similar to Inherent Vice, and it takes place in the 1930s, and it's this detective, Hicks McTaggart, who he is in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and he is kind of swept away and against his will ends up in Europe. Doesn't want to be there, and he comes across a lot bigger problems than just what he initially thought he would face. I'm not going to talk too much about the plot because this is a new book, and I think people are still going to want to read it, and I think people should still read it, even if I think that it's not my favorite or the best. I think people should read this, and I will be rereading this book. And so I'm going to keep this book, I'm going to reread it, because I think there's a lot of good elements to it. I think if we can talk about some of the notes on it, so you might note from my shirt saying Chicago on it, you know, I'm quite familiar with the Midwest, with the Lake Michigan, with Chicago, with Milwaukee. We're going to talk a little bit about it. I think the choice of having the setting of Milwaukee, Wisconsin is a great, brilliant idea. I think that when you think about a 30s noir, the obvious idea is to place it in Chicago, and there's so many references to Chicago that you might think it still is. He's constantly comparing the two, and if you know anything, you know, living in the city of Chicago, I don't know how they do it in Milwaukee. I think they probably think that they're just as great as Chicago, but here in the city of Chicago, and I don't mean this in the most, I don't mean to be mean or belittling, but we see it as a mini Chicago. It's a mini Chicago. They got the same river, the same little layout, and now there's a lot of wonderful things. I've been in Milwaukee many times. It's a great, fun city, and it has its own little character to it, but you could easily confuse it for Chicago and as on a smaller scale. And so I think that's I don't want to belittle it too much, and we'll get into, you know, I'll give it a little back in a second. There's all these comparisons where it's like, oh, if this was Chicago, these would be the mean streets, we'd be dodging bullets, you'd be drinking this, but we're here in Milwaukee, so things are a little slower, and we're doing this, and there's, you know, whatever else. There's a lot of passages like that, which is a great little comparison between the two. And it shows that Pynchon kind of understands that dynamic. And I think ultimately, if you're going to be a postmodern writer, a big part of postmodernism is the subversion of expectations. So you're going to subvert the expectation here of having it be in Chicago, but it's actually in Milwaukee. But also, if you go back to it, there's so many scenes that happen in Chicago to the point where you're going back and forth between the two. And if you don't know the streets names, or you don't know the neighborhoods, you don't know whatever else, you're going to confuse the two. And there's a lot of people reading this book outside of the Midwest, outside of the Great Lakes, who are probably going to ultimately think, you know, it's all just the same thing. So there you go, Milwaukee. Everyone else in the world just thinks we're all the same. It doesn't matter how great Chicago is. People just, it doesn't matter. That's how I'll give it back to you on that. You know, in grand scheme, I think that most of the world, they think it's all the same. So, and I think that's what Pynchon's playing with here. He's going back and forth so many times. But there's a lot of characteristically Milwaukee, or at least Wisconsin things. You know, most famously the cheese empire, the big cheese plot, that's a big part of this. So we've got here a big component is Hicks McTaggart is supposed to go after the daughter of this esteemed family of the cheese royalty, in a sense. This guy who owns a bunch of the whole cheese industry in Wisconsin, and his daughter is off on the run, and he needs to bring her back. It feels in a very similar way to a Big Lebowski or whatever. All these kind of plots, they all line up, and they're all the same kind of concept. There's a chapter in the first 100 pages, probably around page 90 or so in here, where you get the idea of the whole big cheese thing, and it's Pynchon talking about mergers and acquisitions, and like kind of using the cheese industry as an example of mega corporations and how that's kind of forming in the 1920s, 1930s. And I think that's done really well. There's a chapter early on where they go to a bowling alley, and you kind of get introduced to homegrown fascism in the U.S., and I think that's really done really great. But ultimately, I was not a huge fan of the whole stuff that happens in North America in this book. I think that it's fun, but there's not really, it just feels aimless. Every chapter, when it's like 2 or 3 pages, is like introducing one character, it's introducing one plot point, and you're moving the plot one chess point at a time, and so you're kind of picking up and dropping constantly, which, is supposed to be kind of how Pynchon does things, and it's a little confusing, but ultimately it felt like Pynchon can only write for like a page or two without running out of steam for that idea, and that kind of like, it led into the idea that people have had with the apprehensions of, can he still write? I will go back to the Milwaukee aspect, where I think that Milwaukee's a great place to use as a setting point too, because of the population of German and Italians there, and so it's a great introduction to the concepts of fascism in Europe, and how in Germany and Italy at the time fascism was on the rise, and so you kind of can easily transition from the United States to Europe in a really great way. I think that all this talk about the mafia, all this talk about these little social clubs, all that kind of stuff is great. And so, like I said, these little components I think are done really well. But as the writing goes, I think it's the weakest writing. It just doesn't stack up to the other stuff. And I don't think there's really anything bad with that. Like, as someone who's a late in their career author, I don't know how much they really have to prove. But we'll get into it, because I'm going to compare it to an early in their career author. So the whole concept of a postmodern noir set in Wisconsin as a subversion to setting it in Chicago it's been done before. And I'm going to talk about a fun little favorite here, the Driftless Trilogy by Rick Harsch. Hoping you the best, buddy. I really am. Rick Harsch wrote this. These are his first 3 novels, at least that we know of, published. Driftless Trilogy, it takes place in La Crosse, Wisconsin, other side of the state, but they make many references. And it's funny because in this book they even talk about the Driftless Zone, and just if you were to compare the 2 little paragraphs, writing is so much better. Rick Harsch he's writing circles around Pynchon, which is crazy, because I even messaged him that. I was like, hey, you've written a much better book when it comes to a Wisconsin noir, postmodern noir. I'd love to hear, because we'll get into it more with the latter half of this book. I think this book, I hope we can someday hear Rick's thoughts on Shadow Ticket, because just his life of being a Midwesterner, someone who's familiar with the Midwest, and as a writer, and as a postmodern writer, and then someone who's living in the Adriatic area and has studied the fascism history of that area. I would love to hear his thoughts on Shadow Ticket. I hope someday we can do that. We can get that, and I'm praying that we can. Rick Harsch wrote this in 1997 and 2002, these 3 books, and they're a very different kind of book. But if you want a postmodern noir, and the same concept of, we're setting this in the small town, little low stakes Wisconsin versus the big scary Chicago, he's already done this like over 25 years ago. So to me, I was like a little disappointed comparing the 2. That's all I'll say about the Driftless Trilogy. And if I can go to another deja vu I was getting, was we've got other postmodern noirs out there. Just the one that came to mind was Richard Brautigan's Dreaming of Babylon, which was published in the 70s. And of course, very different story, very, very, very different tone. 10 years in setting 1942 instead of 1932. But nonetheless, kind of taking on genre fiction. Like I said, they're both in the, 70s was Brautigan's genre fiction phase, and 21st century, Pynchon's. So I'm not like I said, he doesn't have to be the first one to come to all these ideas, but given who Thomas Pynchon is and the reputation he has, so many of his books have been, known as these like monumental moments, these like innovative, almost avant-garde subjects. And so for this to feel like he's just kind of like chasing the tail of other authors, especially authors that people either don't know or don't respect in the same way, is kind of ridiculous in my opinion. So to move on in the plot, like I said, you can kind of skip ahead if you're someone who wants a little bit less spoilers on stuff. I'm not really trying to talk about spoilers, and I don't even know how much you can spoil. As we leave North America and get into the Atlantic, and for me, the book gets so much better. I'm so much more interested in the book once we leave North America. Hicks McTaggart is drugged, and he wakes up on a ocean liner, and he's meeting all these weird characters, and the mystery really starts to unfold. It becomes more of an international espionage novel versus a crime novel, and I think that's just more interesting in my eyes. I haven't really seen a book like that before. At least I haven't read it. That's not to say they are not out there, but I haven't read it, so I'm a little more intrigued by that. And so I'm just like, the characters coming in are a little bit more interesting to me because they're a little bit more varied in who they are, just their backgrounds, who they are, what they symbolize in the story, all that kind of stuff. We get into Europe, and it's the most I felt like Gravity's Rainbow to any of these other books, because we get into the zone period of Gravity's Rainbow where you're kind of just out in the land, kind of traversing, weird scenarios are happening, and that's kind of what we get into with the latter half of this book, which isn't very long, but it's just a random cast of characters, kind of strange, absurdist things are happening, but they're happening in the dark tones of the background of what's going on in Europe at the time. Some highlights from that are the movie theater scene is really great. That's one of my favorites in the book. The fascist camp in Croatia, another highlight. But ultimately, towards the end, I start to lose a little bit of steam, and I think it ramps back up a little bit. It wraps up nicely on the story plot. Throughout this whole time period, Hicks McTaggart, our protagonist, is just wants to go home. The whole time he's just like, I didn't choose to be here. I was drugged and put on this ocean liner. The authorities said that they would arrest me if I try to leave the continent. So like, he's reluctantly along for the ride, and so that's kind of amusing, and that feels very Pynchonian with all of his other books. And towards the end, he's still ultimately stuck there, and it's just kind of like it's sad but humorous, as Pynchon can be. And ultimately, I will be rereading this. There are parts I really like I said, when he goes on that boat and things start to get a little weirder, and more surrealist, more supernatural, and there's a lot of supernatural elements that I didn't pick up as much. I picked them up, but I didn't explore them in the same degree as I did some of these other topics, like things like the setting in North America, like Chicago versus Milwaukee, or like, why does it say radius on the spine? Why does it say that? Well, did you read close enough? I think, who knows? I didn't look as much into the spiritual stuff, but I did enjoy it. I think it adds to the surrealist, absurdist nature of the book, and I think it's a perfect transition to go from there's weird stuff that happens in the first half of the book, some stuff like that, but it really picks up. You really get a sense that, this is not the normal world when you're on the ocean liner, and then it really picks up when he's in Europe. And I think that it's a great representation of the fact of leaving America, where things are relatively stable and normal, and going to Europe where fascism is on the rise, and it's so absurd because how can this happen? How can fascism take hold in this way and be all-encompassing in so many different cultures and whatnot? And I think that's just done brilliantly. I think that's done really well. I think some of my apprehension with this book, same with Vineland, is I'm just exhausted by reading Pynchon. There's a fatigue element for sure. So, if you're someone who has read all of his books and it's been a couple years since you've had the opportunity to read a new Pynchon book, if it's been since 2013 since you've been able to read a new Pynchon book, I can see this being very exciting. I can see this being a lot more delightful, where you're like, wow, he's still got it, because there's a lot of good ideas in here. It's nowhere near his best, but I think I'm one of the lowest rating on this when it comes to my peers. And like I said, I don't even hate it. I think there's a lot to like about it. Ultimately, I really enjoyed this. I think I'm going to take all of 2026 off from reading Pynchon because I am just so fatigued by it, and I don't want to burn myself out even more. When I go towards the future, I think Bleeding Edge will be the next one. I haven't read that one yet. I think Mason and Dixon. Actually, I don't know. I might go for a big one next. So it might be Mason and Dixon. I'm going to ultimately save Against the Day for the last. And I should say, too, there's a lot of crossover between this and Against the Day from what I've heard from my friends. And if you've read Against the Day, I think you enjoy this a lot more. There's some similar characters. This almost feels like a sequel in many ways, and a bridging gap with the narrative of all of his books kind of going together. And I could see this being a lot more enjoyable if you have read that, which totally fair. I'm not at that point yet. So I think when I reread this book, it'll be after I read Against the Day. Like I said, that's kind of where I'm going with things. I don't think I'm going to read any Pynchon next year. I've got plenty of other postmodern authors to read and other things to explore. And there's more out there to read than just this kind of stuff. So ultimately, enjoyable, but I think everyone taps out, at least for me. There's only so much of any author I can read in 1 year. I read 4 Sorokin novels in 2022, and I was sick of him by the end of it, and I took time off, and I was like, I'm not reading anymore until I've taken enough time away. So I think that's ultimately what's happening here with Pynchon, because like I said, I'm just seeing it in a different way than everyone else is. But none to say, still a big fan of everything he's done. It's all worth reading and rereading, and I will continue to do so. So hope you have a good time and have a good one. Bye.